Welcome to In Confidence, where what we share in confidence helps us grow in confidence. Today's episode is all about what to do if you've been fired, laid off, or restructured out of your role. We're going to cover this topic because over the last few months, I've been reading all of these press releases about how major companies have laid off percentages of their workforce. I've also had a number of friends get laid off or fired in the last year. And it's a deeply personal topic to me because I've been through this. And I want to get into three things as part of this episode. One, what happens emotionally and in our brains and bodies when this disruption happens in our life. The second is how to shift your mindset with this specific setback. And the third is some practical strategies for what you can do when this happens. If it hasn't happened to you, maybe this is an episode for a friend or a family member that's going through it. But I really believe that darkness cannot survive the light of connection. So I wanted us to tackle this incredibly important life topic. So I want to start with a little bit about just my own experience. When I left consulting in 2011, before I started my own company in 2013, I took a role as the CEO of a startup. And for 6 months, I built that team, really worked around the clock. And there was this one day where the board of the company asked me to come into the office early. I walked into the office thinking that we were going to be talking about fundraising or strategy. And within about 10 minutes, I realized something was off. First of all, the entire board wasn't there. It was just one person from the board. He sat me down in the conference room and said, "We are letting you go today. You need to hand over your computer, your phone, all of your files." I was shocked because I had spent basically the last 6 months working around the clock to deliver on a set of things that we had agreed on with the board and the founder of the company. I had never been fired like this before. And by the way, because I'd come into the office early, I hadn't brought all of my materials with me. And so they assigned someone to escort me back to my apartment and had me hand over everything. Basically, they took my personal phone, they took my computer, they took any files that I might have had, and the person waited outside of the door of my apartment for me to give them back. It was this really weird moment where I felt like, you don't even trust me to hand back things to you. So here I was, I didn't have a phone, I didn't have a computer, and the first thing I did was call my younger brother, who lived just at the time a few blocks from me. And it's a really deeply shameful and embarrassing experience because I had just spent the 6 months telling my family, my friends, everyone about this really cool company that I was leading. And I was heartbroken. I was in shock. And I called my younger brother, who basically came over to my apartment. We went to the Verizon store to get me a new phone because I didn't have a phone. I went to the Apple store to get a new computer. By the way, I had never used a Mac computer. I had only used a PC. And so I remember sitting there at the Apple store getting a new computer because I needed to be able to just function. And that day was essentially a blur. I can still sit inside the shock, the sadness, the anger, the disappointment, the embarrassment, and the shame of that specific day. And so if you have been laid off or fired or restructured, I 100% can sit inside that day for you. And in my case, I didn't really see it coming. There were hints at it, but there had not been much conversation about it. And then I was told that I would just deal with their lawyers to figure out what our separation would look like. I also had panic about, would I get any severance? Would my contract be honored? I was worried about my own personal finances, looking at it, seeing what savings I could pull on, retirement accounts even, and just getting all my devices back. I'm very lucky that I had one person in my life that I could be completely open with. And my brother literally sat with me that day and just helped me set up all my devices. I want to turn the page though, which is the harder thing is I clammed up. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I had a new phone, so people couldn't even really reach me at that point. And I just went inward. And that entire weekend, I don't quite remember what I did. I remember that old black and white film, The Lost Weekend with Ray Milland, where it literally was a lost weekend, is how I would describe it. And then that weird feeling of Monday morning. Monday morning was so weird because I wasn't going to work. And at that point, all of my friends were going to work. If I went outside my apartment, everyone was headed to the subway. And it was a very dark place to sit inside, which is that Monday morning. And if any of you have had that feeling, you know what I'm talking about. That Monday morning is incredibly hard because you have nothing to do. And if you're financially insecure, everything in your brain is going off. Over the next month, that particular company I was working with, I had a friend who was laid off, actually. And so I had someone else going through a similar thing. And she ended up saying, screw it. Let's go to a movie in the middle of the day because we can. Let's go sit at a museum. I actually at the time lived near the Museum of Modern Art. Let's go in the middle of the day when no one's there. And I was quite lucky because I had that month while we were getting the legal agreements, the separations, everything signed, figuring out how much severance I would get. I just had one other person to go through it with. And I'm very lucky about that. So if you're going through this, I understand. I understand all of those feelings and how hard that day is. But what's even harder is that first weekday, that first Monday when everyone's going to work and you're not going to work. And you're sort of thinking, what am I going to do? So I'm going to dive into what are the emotions that we all need to process when we're going through that, how to shift our mindset, and some practical strategies of what to do next. So in terms of what's happening, when you lose a job, I believe you're losing a part of yourself because so much of our identity is tied to our work. And so when your self-worth is tied to that job title, without it, you just wonder who you are. From a brain chemistry standpoint, our team actually looked at this, and I thought this was fascinating. When you lose a job, it triggers your brain's threat response. And in your body, the hypothalamus tells your adrenal gland to release adrenaline and cortisol. So the adrenaline, we've all had an adrenaline rush. It increases our energy. It really gives us a deep sense of concentration, and actually we might focus more deeply on the loss. And that cortisol, which is a stress hormone, floods your body. If that cortisol hormone stays in your body, it literally has a long-term effect. It has brain fog, impaired memory, concentration, and decision-making is affected. And so that level of stress impacts your entire nervous system, your digestion, your immune system. You can't sleep. And so from a brain chemistry standpoint, that neural pathway is incredibly deep. And what we found is some of the more positive hormones like oxytocin or dopamine, those actually don't have a lasting effect in the brain. You really need to trigger those over and over again. But things like cortisol or stress pathways, they create a deep mental pathway, a neural pathway that's much harder to overcome. I think when that brain stress response is activated, it triggers our inner critic. And I think the two elements of the inner critic, we talked last season about the 6 forces that hold us back, the 6 things that affect our inner critic. There are 2 that really get activated when that happens. The first is the shrinking effect. So this is where we think that we're less than, we underestimate ourselves, we shortchange our abilities. That's absolutely activated because we all of a sudden think to ourselves, why am I not good enough to be in my job? Is there something wrong with me? Am I less than? The second thing is what we call satisfaction conundrum, where we tie our self-worth to an external marker of success. So when your job or your identity is defined by the work you do, you obviously feel dissatisfaction and you're tied up in external metrics. We shared a story during the holidays last year of a person named Aaron. And this person had been laid off right before the holidays. And he was going to a Friendsgiving event. And this is a person who loved the holidays, really loved any opportunity to get together with other people. And he said, I am really not looking forward to Friendsgiving because I haven't told anybody I've been laid off. And the first thing people are going to ask me is, what's work? How's work going? What are you up to? What are you working on? And he literally felt smaller going into every single conversation because his inner critic was telling him he wasn't as accomplished as his friend group, or he wasn't as accomplished because he had lost his job. He was focusing on what he didn't have rather than what he did have. And so a lot of that inner critic comes to the forefront when we've been laid off, restructured, or fired. And that was something that was helpful for me to understand too. In fact, I can go back in time to when I was fired and start to think about that shame and embarrassment. And I had told everyone I was going to be running this high-profile startup, and all of a sudden that was ripped away. I definitely felt less than others, and I was deeply ashamed. I will say friends tell me now, we were really worried about you because we didn't hear from you for almost a month. And so that emotional impact of a loss, like a job, we really have to give ourselves permission to grieve it. I think it is 100% okay to sit inside that sadness and that anger and that disappointment. And then when you are ready, because I think if we don't acknowledge it and we gloss it over, it just sits inside our brains, ready to haunt us at another time. So I think it's important to decode what you're feeling. And if you are lucky enough, I think it is important to have a shame buddy, have someone that will sit inside. I had a girlfriend from college. This was over a decade ago, and she was fired. And the two of my best friends, she called us, she told us, we raced right over to her apartment, and she sat in her big red armchair, and we ordered takeout and watched old episodes of Sex and the City on DVD. That's how long ago this was, by the way. So we all are feeling that level of our inner critic coming to the forefront when we lose a job. So what do we do about it? First, we have to shift our mindset. Because we've allowed shrinking effect and satisfaction conundrum to come to the forefront, it's really important to change our brain chemistry in this moment. The first thing I want you to do from a mindset standpoint is overcome satisfaction conundrum and realize while you might have loved that job, the job does not define you. And it doesn't define who you are and how the people in your life see you. The world doesn't see you for your job title. The world sees you for you. And once you make that shift, that's a really important shift to make. I think even if you haven't lost a job, that's an important shift to make, is that external markers don't define me. The second thing is about channeling what we call the self-sustaining superpower. The self-sustaining superpower focuses on our internal values and our internal worth before the world sees it. And you have to acknowledge you do have strengths because that is what has gotten you this far. Long-term high cortisol levels affect our emotional regulation and mental agility. So we can't give ourselves to the inner critic mindset. If you can wrap yourself around your internal self-worth and your strengths and your resources, your brain starts working for you and not against you. So I think it's really important that we take a moment and focus on our internal strengths. You could take our superpower quiz if you haven't done it already. We have a lot of people, especially when they're interviewing for a new job, take that quiz before they go on the job interview to remind themselves of just how capable and powerful they are. But what I also want you to think about is how far you've come Sometimes we don't want to win the most valuable player award. We want to win the most improved player award. Because if you think about your resilience, how you've gotten stronger, the ways in which you've improved, you start to think about your own worth instead of your job status. So I want you to take a moment and shift your focus from job loss to growth. Reflect on the new skills you're learning, meaningful relationships. What are you gaining and creating in this moment? I think you can only get there, by the way, once you have grieved that loss and moved into a place where you say, I don't want the cortisol to take over. I don't want the stress to take over. I'm going to take a step back. For me, it was literally, I did go underground for a month, and I reached out to my brother, my other friend who had also been laid off. And those two people, plus my mom, I think my mom is always at the forefront, and my lawyer, I had a group of people who could help me start to shift my mindset and reminded me often of my possibilities, of how far I've come, and that perhaps this break was an important one for me to reshift my purpose and my passion and align it more closely with my values in my next opportunity. What do you do though? Practically, what do you do? Well, I would say the first thing is pick your shame buddies. I really want to reinforce darkness cannot survive the light of connection. There are a handful of people in your life for whom you can be your full self with. And those are the people you need to tell immediately. Do not hold on to that information. I had a friend who lost their job last January, and the person texted me. I was traveling, I was in California, and said, I was just laid off. Can you talk? And during a break, I called that person right away. And I think they just needed one person to know, because once you tell one person, the shame and embarrassment doesn't live inside with you. You've shared that burden with someone else. So I think pick your shame buddy, the people who accept you for everything you are, and even in the face of loss, will be there for you. It may not be that they can help you financially, or they might just be someone that you can share that burden with. The second thing is don't lose momentum. I truly feel like inertia is real. An object at rest stays at rest. An object in movement stays in movement. Some of you might remember that old Hugh Grant movie About a Boy, and it's a little different situation, but he talks about his day in units. He sort of says going to the gym is a half a unit, going to see a friend is 2 units, and he literally divided up his day into units just to make sure that the day kept moving for him. And I think it's important to not lose momentum. So when you've grieved, when you've had a chance to shift your mindset, by the way, that mindset, you might come in and out of it. For that first couple months after I lost my job, every once in a while, I'd go back to that inner critic or that moment of grief, or I'd think about the people I had worked with. You're going to come in and out of it. So having that moment to say, okay, I'm not going to let that take over, just being aware of it. I think that self-awareness helps you get back into a place of flow. But you want to have tiny steps that ladder up. And I think we think of finding a new job as this huge mountain we have to tackle. When I think of it as, it's just about little things that add up. So send a few emails every day, reach out to people, go on LinkedIn. My friend who lost his job last January, he basically was out of work for 8 months. And during that time, he kept sending out his resume. And every day he would send out 2 or 3 more, or go on LinkedIn and look. And he got to the final rounds of job interviews. And then the company came back to him and said, we actually just had a restructuring and we're not going to hire for that position. It's not you, we were going to hire you. But in fact, from a budget standpoint, we're not going to fill that position at this time. And he was so upset. He was so distraught because in the summertime, he thought he'd locked in a job that was perfect for him. Fast forward 6 weeks later, because every day he was checking LinkedIn, that same company in a different division had posted a job opening. And he reached out to the person he had interviewed with and said, I know this is not your division, but I'm going to go ahead and submit my resume. Because I did so well through the job interview process, would you mind putting in a good word for me? And he got that job. And that person that he had interviewed with initially, who said, we don't have a job to offer you at this time, wrote him the most glowing recommendation and said, this is someone we would have hired if we had the budget. I highly recommend this person as your new hire. And he got that job and started it in September. So I do think don't lose momentum. Even if you think you're emailing into the darkness, keep emailing, keep reaching out. Because if you don't, if you stay at rest and you stop, you move inward and you stop seeing what opportunities out there. You got to actually be outward facing. And I know that is so hard to do, especially when you have all these other emotions going on. The third is, if you're nervous about runway, I do think it's really important to look at your finances, figure out what's imperative, where you might need to ask others for help. Life is short when it comes to relationships and health, but long when it comes to second chances and redemption. And so understand that you might need to take a step back and plan what's mission critical, what you can actually delay from a finance standpoint, and ask for help if you can. If you have family, friends, network, or look for short-term opportunities, freelance opportunities, but making sure you understand your runway, because that financial runway will catch up with you. The next thing is redefine success. And I think during this time period, when you are emerging from that sense of grief and loss and you're figuring out what to do next, you want to redefine your success in the world based on your strengths, your character, your resilience, and how you show up in the world. How you show up during this time is really critical because it says something about who you are. I saw this really interesting piece from Roger Federer. He was doing a graduation speech. He was doing a commencement speech. And he said to the audience, he said, I have been the top of my field at one point, and I want you to guess what percentage of the shots did I make, in terms of volleys and returns, and what percentage I didn't make. And he said, if you look at my statistics at the peak of my career, I only had 54% of my shots be winners. 46% of my shots were losers. And yet I kept going. And he said, one of the things that I did a really good job at is forgetting the losers and focusing on the winners. And he said, but 1 out of 2 shots were winners and 1 out of 2 were losers. But I kept focusing on the shots that I won and continued to power myself to peak performance. The last thing I want you to recognize is your own resourcefulness. Because when you are actually focusing on the resources you do have and not what you've lost, you can power yourself to that next job opportunity. If you focus on what you don't have, you allow adrenaline, cortisol, the stress hormones to continue to impair your brain, your memory, and your concentration. Over and over again, during that 1.5 year period that I was out of work, luckily I had some financial runway built in. I came in and out of this sense of grief and loss. And out of that, I kept saying to myself, what am I distinctive at? What are my opportunities? And it led to the creation of this company. I often tell people I live off the fumes of that 1.5 years. Because once I was able to turn the page and turn the corner, I focused on where I wanted to put my resources. And that resourcefulness has paid back in spades. Overall, I hope the biggest message you take from this is your self-worth is not tied to your job status. Your self-worth is tied to your character, your resilience, and your strengths. Every setback is an opportunity for us to redefine ourselves, to grow, to stretch, and to connect with others. You have internal strengths that no job can take away. Tap into those qualities during this challenging time. And I always say it's one foot in front of the other. You don't need to have everything figured out right away. Keep moving forward. Keep that momentum going. Stay connected to your strengths. And most importantly, be kind to yourself during this time. I want to call back to my friend who also got laid off at the same time I did when I lost my job. And her mother invited us to come for a week to their family summer home. And during that week, my friend sent out, I want to say 100 resumes. And she has an athlete personality. I would say she scores very high on achieving and knowing in our Superpower quiz. And self-sustaining, by the way. I actually think she might be my role model for self-sustaining. And within a month, she found her next opportunity. But she took that week. We were away. I think it's easier too when you're relaxed. Your brain can do its best work when you feel psychologically safe. We were at her mother's house. And she powered through. And her mom at dinner time would say, I'm so proud of you two girls. You're just thinking about the dream and what's next for you. I hope you love this episode of In Confidence. I hope you're leaving this space stronger than when you entered it. If you've been laid off, fired, restructured, I see you. I know how hard this time is for you. And I hope some of these ideas help you through this very challenging time. If you love this episode or you think someone in your life needs to hear it, please share it with them. Subscribe so you never miss a moment of inspiration or insight. And then until next time, in the words of my 9-year-old self, and these words could not matter more, especially in moments like this, I see you, I value you, and I believe in you. This is In Confidence.